I was just a teenager when I took on the babysitting gig. It was for a single dad, a man who seemed like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. He told me his wife had passed away during childbirth, and I remember feeling an immediate pang of sympathy for him. A single dad, doing everything he could to support his little boy. His son was only 3 at the time, sweet, with those big, innocent eyes that always seemed to be searching for something. It was an easy night. I had been babysitting for a while by then, and this seemed like just another job. The dad had a business meeting that would run late, and he told me he probably wouldn't be back until around 10 p.m. It was about 8:30 when I was sitting with his son in the living room, reading him a book. It was a peaceful moment, the quiet kind where the only sound was my voice and the crackle of the fireplace in the background. But then, something changed. I was mid-sentence when the boy looked up at me and said, "Stop." His tone wasn't the usual whiny kid voice. It was calm, almost deliberate. I lowered the book, a bit confused, and before I could ask what was wrong, he started singing. It wasn't the cheerful sing-song voice of a typical toddler either. No, this was slow, almost eerie. "The itsy-bitsy spider climbed up the water spout and pushed Mama off," he sang, his little face expressionless. Then the sun came out and buried the mama's body in the ground. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second the room felt colder, the air heavier. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, frozen, as he went back to playing with his toys like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just sung something that sent chills down my spine. I tried to shake it off. "He's 3, I told myself. Kids say weird things, but something about the way he sang it, the monotone, the twisted lyrics, it didn't feel like something he made up on his own. When the dad came home around 10, I couldn't hold back. I told him what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off, or maybe offer some explanation. But when the words left my mouth, his entire demeanor shifted. His face went pale, and he stood there, completely still, as if he were made of stone. I didn't know what to say after that, so I just stood awkwardly, waiting for some kind of response. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and tight. "It's time for you to go." There was no small talk, no questions about how the night had gone. He just pulled out his wallet and handed me cash. A lot more than what we had agreed on. $200 more to be exact. I remember holding it, my mind racing with confusion, but I didn't say a word. I was young, and the extra money seemed like a blessing at the time. So I thanked him, grabbed my bag, and left without a second thought. It wasn't until years later, almost 10 years to the day, that I found out the truth. I had long since moved away from that town, but I still kept in touch with a few old friends. One evening, out of nowhere, I got a message from a friend who lived nearby. It was a news article, a headline that immediately sent a wave of nausea through me. "Local father arrested for wife's murder. Body found buried in backyard after 10 years. My mind went blank as I clicked the link, barely able to process the words on the screen. The man's picture filled my phone. The dad, the one I had babysat for all those years ago. The article explained how new evidence had surfaced in the case of his wife's death, and how authorities had discovered her body buried in their backyard, right where she had been all along. I sat there, shaking, as the memories flooded back. The little boy's song, the way the father had reacted when I told him about it. It hit me like a tidal wave. The sun came out and buried the mama's body in the ground. Those words, that twisted nursery rhyme, it wasn't just a creepy thing a kid said. He knew. Somehow, even at that age, he knew. Looking back, I wonder how much more he might have known. How many other things he said or did that might have been clues, hints at the dark secret buried beneath their feet. Did he remember seeing it happen? Had he heard something? Seen something? I'll never know for sure. But what haunts me the most is the father's reaction that night. The way his face drained of color. The way he rushed me out of the house, shoving extra cash into my hands like it would erase everything. He knew. And for years, he lived with that secret, hiding behind the facade of a grieving widower. I still think about that little boy sometimes. What kind of person he grew up to be. Whether he ever fully understood what happened to his mother. And I wonder if, deep down, he always knew the truth. It was a typical evening at home. I was supposed to be watching my little brother while my mom went out to a birthday dinner. Nothing out of the ordinary. He was 6, an age where everything is an adventure or a game. But he wasn't the kind of kid who had imaginary friends or played make-believe all that often. Still, I knew it was my job to check on him, make sure he wasn't getting into any trouble. As I walked down the hallway to his room, I noticed something strange. His door was half open, and I could hear him whispering. Soft, hushed words, but too quiet for me to make out what he was saying. I stepped closer and peered in through the crack. There he was, standing in the middle of his room, facing the open closet. His eyes were fixed on something inside. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping fully into the room. He didn't flinch, didn't look startled. He just turned his head slightly toward me and said, "I'm talking to my friend." I hesitated. "Your friend?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice casual, like this was completely normal. "My friend from the closet." Now, my brother wasn't the kind of kid with an overactive imagination, not like other kids his age. He preferred action figures, video games, things with rules, things that made sense. So, the idea of him having a friend in the closet felt off. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe he had picked up some new game from school or seen something on TV. Kids will be kids after all. But then, as I turned to leave the room, I felt something cold, a tap on my shoulder. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of tap you'd feel if someone wanted to get your attention without being too forceful. I spun around, half expecting to see my brother playing a prank on me. But when I turned, he was still standing by the closet, staring at me. No, not at me, into me. His eyes had a strange intensity, like he was seeing something beyond my skin, beyond the room itself. And then he smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent a chill crawling up my spine. "My friend likes you," he said, his voice soft but unnervingly certain. I stood frozen for a second, trying to process what he had just said. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. My instincts told me to leave, but I couldn't. Not until I checked the closet. I walked over, slowly, every step feeling like I was walking through molasses. My heart pounded in my chest, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. I yanked it open, fully expecting... what? I don't even know. But it was empty. Clothes, toys, and old stuffed bear slumped in the corner. Nothing else. "See? There's nothing here," I said, more to myself than to my brother. But he just kept staring, that eerie smile still plastered on his face. "Where's your friend now?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked. "He's gone," my brother replied, his tone flat. "He said he'll be back later." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that had been standing in the room with us just moments ago. I checked the entire house after that, going room to room, opening every closet, every cabinet. But of course, I didn't find anything. When my mom got home later that night, I told her about what happened. She laughed it off, saying I was overthinking it. "Kids have wild imaginations," she said. "You're reading too much into it." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But something about that night never sat right with me. It felt too real, too wrong, to just be chalked up to a game. I let it go, though. We never spoke about it again. At least not for a long time. Years passed, and life moved on. The memory of that night faded, but it was always there in the back of my mind, lurking like a shadow that stretched longer than it should. I hadn't thought about it in a while, until one day, completely out of the blue, I asked my brother if he remembered his friend from the closet. We were older now, both of us well into our teens, and the house had long since lost its eerie charm. I didn't expect him to remember, but he did. "Oh yeah," he said casually, as if I had asked him about an old toy. "I remember him." My stomach dropped. "What was that all about, anyway?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "You always talked about your friend like he was real." My brother shrugged. "He was real. At least, I think he was." I stared at him, waiting for more, feeling that same creeping unease from years ago. "What do you mean?" He paused, as if weighing how much to tell me. Then, in the same nonchalant voice he had used all those years ago, he said, "He was just a friend. He stayed in the closet for a while. Then one day he told me he was moving. I guess he left." I felt a chill run through me. Why did he move? My brother looked at me, a strange glint in his eyes. "I don't know. He just said it was time to go." We never talked about it again after that, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. Sometimes, late at night, I'll think back to that night and wonder, who or what was my brother really talking to? And why did it tap me on the shoulder? When we were kids, my little brother and I were inseparable, but there was a period, about a year, where it felt like we were glued together. Not by choice, though. He was terrified to sleep in his own room at night. During the day, everything was fine. He'd hang out in there, play with his toys, do whatever kids do. But once the sun went down, that room became a no-go zone. It got to the point where we pretty much shared my room. My parents didn't think much of it. Just a phase, they said. Kids get scared of the dark all the time, but it wasn't the dark that scared him. It was something else. I'd ask him why he couldn't sleep in his room. He was always reluctant to talk about it, but one night, after another failed attempt to get him to stay in there, I pushed a little harder. That's when he told me. "There's a little boy in my room," he whispered, eyes wide like he was confessing some deep secret. "He talks to me at night." I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or be creeped out. "A boy? What do you mean?" "He comes out when it's dark," my brother said, gripping the edge of his blanket. "He likes my toys. He always wants to play with me, but I don't want to play with him." At the time, I chalked it up to imagination. He was young, maybe 6 or 7, and kids say weird things. Still, the way he said it made my skin crawl. But we were kids, and kids have overactive imaginations. At least, that's what I told myself. For almost a year, he wouldn't sleep in his room. Every night, he would come to mine, claiming that the little boy wouldn't leave him alone. Sometimes he'd wake me up, whispering that the boy was standing by the closet or sitting on the end of the bed, staring at him, waiting for him to play. It freaked me out, but I figured it was just nightmares, nothing more. Eventually, the fear faded. By the time we hit middle school, he was back in his room, and the little boy was never mentioned again. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But years later, when we were in high school, our parents dropped a bomb on us. We were having one of those late-night family conversations, the kind where everyone's reminiscing about the past. And out of nowhere, my mom mentioned something about our old house, the one where my brother had refused to sleep in his room. "Did we ever tell you guys that a little boy used to live there?" she said, almost offhandedly, like it was no big deal. My brother and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Mom sighed, looking a little uncomfortable. "We didn't want to tell you when you were younger. We didn't want to freak you out. But the family who lived there before us, well, they had a little boy. He drowned in the bathtub. I felt the blood drain from my face. My brother, who had been quiet up until then, spoke up. When? My mom hesitated. About a year before we moved in. He was around your age, she said, nodding toward my brother. It was a horrible accident. The parents sold the house not long after it happened. I stared at my brother, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. He looked pale, his mouth slightly open, like he was trying to process what he was hearing. You never told us, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't want to scare you, my dad added, looking down at his hands. It's not the kind of thing you tell kids. My brother stood up, pacing a little, his face contorted in disbelief. Mom? Dad? I saw him, he said, the words tumbling out of him like he was confessing something terrible. The boy. He was in my room. The room went dead quiet. He told them everything. About the boy who wanted to play with his toys. About how he would see him standing by the closet, waiting for him in the middle of the night. He told them about the year he spent sleeping in my room because he couldn't bear the idea of being alone with that boy. My parents listened, looking more and more horrified with every word. I thought it was just nightmares, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. I didn't know what it was, my brother said, his voice shaky. But he was there. I didn't make him up. That conversation ended abruptly after that. My parents didn't want to talk about it anymore, and my brother, well, he didn't bring it up again either. But after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. All those times he had come to my room, terrified, insisting that the boy was there with him. I had brushed it off like it was just some childhood fear. But it wasn't. Even now, all these years later, I can't shake the feeling that something really was in that room with him. Something that liked his toys. Something that wanted to play. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if that boy is still there, waiting for someone else to play with.